Greetings and welcome to our daily walk through the scripture for June the 9th. Your readings for today find you in 1 Kings chapter 7. Acts chapter 7, we're continuing Stephen's incredible sermon in verses 30 through 50. Psalm 128, 1 through 6, and Proverbs chapter 16, verses 31 through 33. Now, I told you in yesterday's video that we were going to talk about Stephen. I was off by a day. Stephen's still in the middle of his incredible sermon. We want to get to the climax of the sermon and the aftermath of that sermon, and then we'll come back to that. So we're going to continue hanging out in 1 Kings a little bit today. And the very first sentence, there should be a moment when you go, huh? Because it says in verse 1 of chapter 7, it took Solomon 13 years, however, to complete the construction of his palace. Now, the reason why you would go, huh, is because how long did it take for Solomon to build the temple? 7 years, right? 7 years. You would think that the temple of God would be the most glorious place in Jerusalem, that it would be the place, the spectacle of all spectacles. And while the temple was certainly magnificent and certainly amazing and certainly the symbol of God's blessing and his covenant with the Israelites, Solomon's palace was much more significant. Now, here's a couple things to think about and wonder about. First of all, where did Saul and then David live? Did they have a palace? Well, the answer is yes. David had a palace of some kind, but obviously Solomon wasn't content with it. Now, why wouldn't Solomon be content with it? Well, we're going to answer that in a couple of different ways. One of them, we have to remember that Solomon at this point has had a number of years to start accumulating a great amount of wealth, accumulate a great amount of fame, and accumulate a great number of wives. So one of the reasons that Solomon continued to build onto his temple was so that he could have a place for all of his wives and his concubine. See, Solomon ended up having to put it lightly, a very large court. Okay, not only of officials and people that helped run the daily government of Israel, but also his family and his personal life and all of the trappings that came with it. But this is an example of where Solomon's pride begins to take place. And we'll get a little bit more reveal of that when we get into the book of Ecclesiastes, whom people ascribe to Solomon, to the teacher. And whether it's actually Solomon or not, there might be a little bit of debate for that. But we're going to attribute it to him for now. And we're going to look and we're going to see that pride becomes a real issue for Solomon. And his temple is very much that way. His temple shows a great amount of pride. The size of it, the grandeur of it made it bigger than the temple, and made it in some ways more elaborate than the temple. Now, that's not to say that Solomon forgot God in any way, shape, or form at this point. He hadn't. He had not at all. We don't learn until a little bit later in the readings of 1 Kings that Solomon had fallen away in his older years. But for now, Solomon's very faithful. So while the temple is being built, his palace is being built, and we're having a significant amount of work done. But we see Solomon then begin to kind of craft the furnishings of the temple. Now remember, this is all based on the tabernacle that we read about in Exodus. If you have a Bible, a lot of Bibles nowadays will actually have a drawing of the tabernacle and some kind of depiction of the temple. I recommend that you take a look at the two and kind of compare them and see how they were very similar and maybe even some of the differences. But there's no doubt that God gave very, very clear mandate when he had the tabernacle built of this is how you're going to do it. And those same mandates were used in building the temple. So when you see things, when they talk about, for example, they talk about pillars, they talk about basins, when they talk about the stands of bronze, and then they talk about this thing called the sea, okay, which is this huge basin. Those things were all kind of things that were based around elements of the tabernacle. So go back and read that and look at that and then look at the temple so you get an idea of how it is. Now Solomon did do some of those things as well that were a little bit more elaborate than maybe God had given for the tabernacle. But that's because the tabernacle was tent, whereas this is a building of stone and brick and mortar and really of marble and all these magnificence and of grand beams of cedar and all these different things that were meant to be everlasting. And so there are some differences, but I want you to see that because this is a reminder yet of God, of God saying, this is how I want to be done, so that no shortcuts are taken, which we all know we're prone to do. Okay, that's our conversation for today.